Besides artwork alterations, one of the biggest things that gets changed about Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards when released internationally are the card names. Obviously, cards get translated from Japanese to the language of the country they're being released in, but sometimes Konami doesn't translate names exactly. If it's not a direct translation, they'll sometimes use synonyms, or just keep the Japanese name written out with the Latin alphabet. If the name is a pun in Japanese, they'll do their best to translate it or give it a similar kind of wordplay in English. However, it's not always as straightforward as translating Zubaba Bancho Gagaga Coat. Well, sometimes it is easy to translate, but someone at Konami tries to get a bit too creative with making a card name sound unique that it causes confusion with later cards, or they just wanted to have fun and now we have a card name that sounds kinda goofy. In this video, I'm going to go over some of the weirdest ways that card names were localized in Yu-Gi-Oh! When translated from Japanese to English. I'll just be covering the English names, but most of the time, other international releases used the name changes seen on the English cards. I'll also be grouping together cards that have similar types of name changes for certain entries. And joining me once again are my co-hosts from the card art video, Judgment Meter.
That's me!
Corgian from the Corgian Twitch channel.
Hi, MrTopTenList. Happy to have you here on my wonderful world of Toon Kingdom. Oh wait, no, MrTopTenList on the MrTopTenList channel, my bad.
Sam from the Dungeon Dive Bar podcast.
Stay classy.
And professional skill drain enthusiast, SyzygySolo.
Follow me on Twitter for more screams.
Now, let's excavate the top 10 weirdest translated Yu-Gi-Oh! Card names. Number 10, the hero archetype. Specifically, the first two we saw, Elemental and Destiny. For Elemental heroes, many of them started off with the naming convention in Japanese where it was the monster's power followed by man or lady, like Sparkman, Clayman, or Bubbleman, all the same in Japanese and English. But then you had the other early Elemental heroes that went their own way in the international releases. To look at the original Core 5, Featherman and Burst Lady were changed to Avion and Burstinatrix respectively. Honestly, both names were still pretty cool, like where else are you gonna hear a name like Burstinatrix? But it did take away from the pattern.
Yeah, why did they do that? It's a very difficult word to write down. Hard to research her on Wiki or on the Google.
I think that actually makes a lot of sense when they're going from an originality perspective. I mean, you already have Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern Man, Iron Man. You already have a ton of mans and you have a ton of womans, but you don't have any Burstinatrix. Like, imagine if his name was like Battinatrix. That would sound kind of kinky, actually.
This continued with monsters like Wildman and Necro Darkman, changed to Wildheart and Necroshade respectively. Once again, still cool names in English, but it felt randomized when we would get the literal translated name or a name change. This was not just for monsters that appeared in the dub though. Non-anime monsters like Elemental Hero Airman or Solid Man were changed to Stratos and Solid Soldier respectively, the latter of which wasn't even in the manga, so this was likely all Konami's doing. It was weird that they continued to rename the heroes in English after the first few when the pattern became more obvious, but later elemental heroes like Voltic or Heat went against the original archetypal names by dropping the man in their Japanese names, so it made the other renames in English fit in a bit better with all the variety. Destiny heroes had a similar shakeup where all their Japanese names started with the letter D followed by the word guy. The guy was dropped from all names in English, which was a shame because I thought that was kind of funny. And then Konami altered the first parts of their names accordingly. Monsters like Decision Guy and Dash Guy were changed to Decider and Dasher respectively. The good thing is, the D motif was retained for most of the monsters in the translation, which was the bigger part of their naming gimmick. D was everywhere for these guys. They loved to give us the D. With Diamond Guy, we got even more D in his English name with Diamond Dude.
Also, their support card is called D-Time, and I don't know how to tell you how many times I've sent that as a pickup line.
I love D-Time so much. It's amazing in terms of being a pun.
However, some of the localized names didn't follow this pattern for some reason. Monsters like Diabolical Guy and Die Hard Guy were changed to Malicious and Captain Tenacious, which is at least a fun one to say. You could speculate that some of the names were censored because of references to death or copyrighted properties, but they could have at least followed the D pattern with a rename in English. The most unfortunate one, though, was the boss monster Plasma, who had a cool boss monster name in Japanese, Blood D, or is it Blue D? Blood? The point is, the D was at the end with a hyphen to make it even edgier. Overall, at least with all these name changes, they never altered the hero parts of these monsters' names, so it did not cause problems later on with their search cards or archetype encompassing effects. Number 9, Buster Rancher and many of the Blaster cards. As discussed in our censored art video, gun censorship was frequent on Yu-Gi-Oh! Card art. Monsters like Barrel Dragon had their guns turned neon, and they were made to look more like lasers. However, their renames from the Japanese translation into English still retained their gun origins, just changing names to include barrel instead of words like revolver or gun, so the spirit of the monster was still there, referencing the barrel of the gun. This was also seen on various other cards that originally had gun in their Japanese names, like Gun Behind Hell's Door or Disguised Gun Machine, but it seems Konami did not want to overuse barrel in English names, so they tried out a few different words. The most common example was changing gun to blaster to give it that ambiguous weapon feel, even if the gun implied was not a lethal gun. The Elemental Heroes equip cards like Spark Gun and Bubble Shot were changed to Spark Blaster and Bubble Blaster, the latter of which just had the word shot, not even gun, and that's a water gun, a child's toy. They say water gun in Pokemon. What's wrong with bubble gun? Monsters later on also adopted the word blaster.
Tech Genis Blade Gunner became Tech Genis Blade Blaster. I think there was another card called Buster Blaster.
However, some cards like Gravity Blaster and BES Blaster Cannon Core had Blaster in their Japanese names from the start, so not every English name with Blaster in it was censoring a word synonymous with gun. Good thing Blaster is not an archetype, or else Konami would have a lot of errata work to do. However, the one gun censorship that confuses everyone is the card Buster Rancher, which didn't even have the word gun originally. It was just called Buster Launcher in Japanese, and launcher isn't even a word they're shy to say in English. Look at the spider. Regardless, whatever this guy is using, it's apparently called a Buster Rancher.
Now, I'm not much of a farmer. I never have been. I've spent most of my life in the city, but I don't see a ranch here. But I do see something that could be referred to as a launcher.
See, you've never seen the space ranch bottles. Because of how gravity works up there, they actually have to use special ways to get ranch on their salads. They have to use a Buster cannon. And they just refer to it as the Buster Rancher because otherwise you'll accidentally mix it up with the Buster Ketchuper or the Buster Bustarder.
What is happening?
The main speculation here is that it was just a mistranslation and they weren't trying to cover anything up. They just had to roll with it once it was done, and thus we were stuck with Buster Rancher. Number 8, the Luster Dragons. A common thing for early Yu-Gi-Oh! Translations was to connect two monsters who were unrelated in Japanese by giving them the same names in English, just with number 1 and 2 following them. Sometimes they were palette swaps, other times they were just similar kinds of monsters, but either way, in Japanese, these 1 and 2 monsters were always treated as unique monsters with different names, like Flying Kamakiri 1 and 2 in English were called Dragonfly and Flying Mantis in Japanese, translated, or Rock Ogre Grotto 1 and 2 were called Cave Jin Ogre Rock and War Earth in Japanese, translated again. However, the relation between Luster Dragon and Luster Dragon number 2 seemed unplanned in English. The bigger one, Emerald Dragon in Japanese, was translated to Luster Dragon initially, but afterwards they released a different gem dragon, Sapphire Dragon in Japanese, so the English translation decided this had to be Luster Dragon now. They couldn't pick any other name, nothing else would suit it, so the original Luster Dragon had its name revoked.
You had a card named John, and then you had another card named John, and it's like, what am I gonna do? I gotta summon a John from the deck. You know what? John number 2. I gotcha, baby.
The funny thing is, after renaming him Luster Dragon number 2, they didn't add number 1 to the new Luster Dragon's name, so it didn't even follow the pattern of the 1 and 2 monsters. Plus, you now had the original Luster Dragon being treated as the second coming of Luster Dragon. Original Luster Dragon is getting the shaft here. Why didn't they just call them Emerald and Sapphire Dragons? Those were not confusing names.
Hey! Yay! Where's Jesse?
Number 7, Summoned Skull, Beast of Talwar, and Gazelle, King of Mythical Beasts. These name changes may not seem like that big of a deal, partially since the likes of Summoned Skull and Gazelle are burned into our minds from the anime, but all of them are in the same boat of being standalone monsters from before archetypes were a thing, whose names were not translated with their eventual archetypes in mind. For Summoned Skull and Talwar, they were called Diamond Summoning and Talwar Diamond respectively. Little did Konami know that the diamond in their Japanese name would become one of the biggest archetypes in the series. I'm not sure if they expected it to become so big, but from 2003 onwards, the archetype was official with the first wave of diamond support in both the OCG and the TCG, being called Archfiend in the English version. From here onwards, there were no issues labeling the Archfiends properly when translating anything with diamond in its name, which is just supposed to be demon, but they thought Archfiend sounded cooler, and they were right, it does. However, that still leaves the original few renamed cards with diamond in the Japanese names. For Summoned Skull, do you go back and rename it to include Archfiend like its original Japanese name? Konami's answer was no. Summoned Skull was an iconic part of classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, so they likely did not want to create confusion for future marketing and nostalgic players. He got special treatment of just having some parentheses at the bottom of his card saying that he's counted as an Archfiend. It's pretty rare to see a normal monster have something other than just lore in their text box, so Summoned Skull gets that distinction. If a monster counted as a different monster, it was usually an effect, but you can't just change a normal monster like that without it being a retrain. Beast of Talwar has no excuse though. He just exists and no one would question why his name is now Talwar Archfiend, but he got the parentheses too.
I don't know who that is, though.
What the fuck is a Talwar, and why do people keep bringing it up?
It's the guy's name.
But no. He's the beast of Talwar. This implies that he is a beast from somewhere called Talwar.
Okay, so this is actually a recurring issue in Yu-Gi-Oh! This actually comes up on a lot of cards they do this in. For instance, you know Slifer the Sky Dragon, right? In Japan, it's the Saint Dragon of Osiris. It's not Osiris. It's one of his dragons.
Oh my god, that's why the other one is called Winged Dragon of Ra. But what about Obelisk?
He's giant god soldier of the obelisk. He's not even a god. He's a guardian.
Guardian is its own thing. Wait, be careful with that word.
Arsenal Summoner!
Also treated as an Archfiend card is our great friend, the Axe of Despair, in his coconut carving problem.
Wait, really?
Yeah, Axe of Despair is Demon's Axe.
I think it's actually the first archetypal equip spell,
It
simply
is.
by accident. This
What?
witty comment is also treated as an Archfiend card.
They didn't learn from this mistake because there are more equip cards that do this. Celestial Sordiatos is Holy Arms in Japan, and that's the name for the Noble Arms category in Yu-Gi-Oh!
The main other example of the parentheses on a normal monster was with Gazelle, King of Mythical Beasts, who was Phantom Beast King Gazelle in Japanese. Once the Phantom Beasts became an archetype, Gazelle and his fusion got similar treatment that Summoned Skull did, where they did not change their English name to include Phantom Beast like the Japanese name. Though I'm more distracted that his actual name is Gazelle in both Japanese and English, and he's not really a gazelle.
It's like a fancy deer. Not saying that deers aren't fancy, but it's like rar.
It is nowhere near related to the king of anything. It is a goat. And yet he is not. He is some kind of werebeast.
Maybe gazelle means something different in the Phantom Beast language. Perhaps it's a common name, like John.
I feel like that's a good name for a dog. And has a monocle and maybe a pipe.
Number 6, all the monsters with deaths in their name. This doesn't belong to a specific archetype or reoccurring effect, but for TCG players, you'll probably notice that there's a lot of monsters that have deaths in their name. I never questioned what that was supposed to mean since I was used to Yu-Gi-Oh! Putting sounds in names that I never understood, but this naming convention was actually censorship. The deaths in these monsters' names was Desu in Japanese, which translates to death, and Konami was a bit skittish about having death front and center in a bunch of monsters' names when translated, so they essentially did not translate the deaths in the name and left it there.
I refer to them personally as the Death Zoo because so many of them are just regular animals. I love Death Frog, Death Croaking, Death Koala, Death Kangaroo.
D3S Frog.
Despacito.
Death's Mosquito.
Then there's this one, which doesn't really fit in my zoo, which is Death Volksgolf.
You really don't have a Volstgolf exhibit?
I don't, but I do have a Death Dendel exhibit.
What's a Dendel? Dende!
And then Dark Ruler Hadeth.
I like Dark Ruler Hades because it's just, they wanted to put Hades, but they couldn't.
I'm partial to Des Lacuda.
I have a question about Des Lacuda. What's a Lacuda?
I'm gonna look up a Lacuda, and I'm gonna bet you it's gonna be Yu-Gi-Oh! 3-hump Lacuda.
Because it has to do with 3-hump Lacuda. Okay, that actually makes sense. They tend to do that with a lot of cards.
This goes into the Japanese transliteration section because Lacuda in English is Rakuda in Japanese, which is camel. They could have just called it Des Camel and 3-hump Camel, but no, they named it Lacuda.
Lacuda Matata.
Learning is fun.
I also give credit to Des Feral for being a retrain of the little green guy, Vicer Des for putting the Des at the end of his name, and Masked Beast Des Guardius for being an underrated boss monster who will make you play bad normal monsters in your deck, or use the Mass Tribute skill in Duel Links. I actually think that's pretty useful for the deck. Number 5, Totally Awesome and Frog the Jam. Totally Awesome's translated name has a bad rep, but I think it's a funny name. No one ever criticizes Treeborn Frog for its punny English name, so I give Totally Awesome a pass. I think it's easier to say than its original planned English name, which would have been Tree Toad. Treat Toad? Treat Toad? Totally Awesome. The Treat Toad name was meant to be a pun on it being a toad made out of mochi, which the Japanese name Mochi Frog states. It would have been easier just to call him Mochi Frog in English, or something like Pastry Toad if they wanted a vague name for international releases, but I'll take what we can get. Its effect made him more infamous than the name did.
Oh, now I can see why this is obnoxious. That's miserable.
The funniest part is you can summon it off of Bahamut Shark, which is a rank 4, which means it's a lot easier to actually summon than you think it is.
No frog deck actually uses Totally Awesome. Only rank 4 water decks do.
I mean, frog decks also use Toad, but yeah, it's rank 4 water decks use it a lot better.
But if you want the real translated name that caused chaos in the frog archetype, look no further than Frog the Jam. When frogs were introduced as an archetype, in Japanese, they didn't have to worry about other pre-existing monsters that already had frog in their name. But because the effects had to include the same monsters in English as they do in Japanese, it would be a shame if there was a card that had frog in just the English name and not the Japanese. Enter Frog the Jam. In Japanese, his name just translated to Toad Slime, no frog anywhere, so we couldn't have this single fake frog monster relevant in just one version of the game. It didn't matter that he was a weak normal monster that had no utility in a frog deck. Because of this, every frog archetype card specifically had to mention that Frog the Jam was not applicable to any frog-related effects, solely to keep it consistent.
He doesn't want to be left out. Let him join the party. Let him join the party.
I actually found the name Frog the Jam to be pretty cool, so it wouldn't have been considered weird if it didn't have such a glaring restriction with frog cards in English. Konami eventually re-released Frog the Jam with a name closer to its Japanese name, but its legacy was already set in stone at that point. Even though the explanation of his exclusion makes sense, and it's a moot point now, people still like to make conspiracies on how Frog the Jam has some sort of hidden OP power that caused him to be restricted from the frog decks.
Okay, so Frog the Jam, my theory. So they changed it to Slime Toad simply because if you put this level 2 frog monster, no effect, inside of frogs, it fundamentally breaks the deck. I can't explain how, and I have actually no experience with the deck, but I can assure you.
If you were to use Slime Toad in that deck and it was allowed, you would be topping every single event for years to come. It would be immune from the ban list. You would everyone. It is by far the most busted card that just will be constantly banned from the meta it belongs in.
You know the line like, I'm not trapped in here with you, you're trapped in here with me? That's how it would feel if you were to play against Slime Toad Frog Stun. Like, you'd be like, oh, he's just a small normal monster, I will simply hit over him. And then just for whatever reason, you couldn't.
Frog the Jam, pop up the jam!
Number 4, Interplanetarypurplythorny Beast and Interplanetarypurplythorny Dragon.
I don't need to say a word about this. Just read the text. Just look at the name of the card. That's all you gotta say.
Interplanetarypurplythorny Dragon. Yeah, they did do that.
Actually, Shakespeare wrote these cards. You're supposed to read them in iambic pentameter. Interplanetarypurplythorny. Nitrak,
No.
and Beast.
No, that's not, no.
The original names translated to Otherworldly, Thorny Purple, Beast, and Dragon, and someone at Konami apparently wanted to combine all these words for fun. This falls into the category of those cards with names that are so silly, people immediately think, what are you doing, as soon as they see them, like Mind Hacksaws, That Wacky Magic, or Dr. Frankenderp. The Purply Thorny dudes are always among the first brought up when talking about how localization is really reaching for that comedic name sometimes. I like people having fun with their job, but maybe they should have translated these ones a bit more literally.
Also, what's really funny about this is in other languages where you don't typically form portmanahues, it created portmanahues. So, for example, like in Spanish, it became Interplanetarypurplythorny, and
I love the German name because it's Interplanetarypurplythorny Draco. It rolls off the tongue. It rolls off the tongue, honestly.
Number 3, Giant Trunade. I always thought the face in the storm was named Trunade, so I never questioned it, but that was never the case.
I want you all to think back to all your weather phenomenons, and I want you to tell me what a trunade is. Have you heard of it before? Do you know anything of when your town or village was hit by a trunade? Of course you don't, because it's not real. It is a made-up word. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has completely made up this word. And then, because it's not a real word, it also became very bizarre when they retrained the card, but they didn't change the name. So we had Giant Trunade, which was a disaster in multiple terms, both in the artwork as well as what it was doing to the meta. It should not have been legal at any point. But also, it then became Hey Trunade. So they didn't change the fact that it was still a trunade, which is supposed to be their attempt at doing a transliteration of the Japanese concept of a hurricane or tornado.
Hey, we are a hurricane.
That's it. You could say giant Ryumu.
Tatsumaki Senpuken!
214K.
But no, you created the concept of a trunade, and now Yu-Gi-Oh! Is constantly plagued by this concept of fake weather.
Trunade is defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary as a breeze that is strong enough to pick up cards and put them back in your hand.
I didn't really mind them keeping Trunade, but the hey in the name made me think this was supposed to be a funny card. I saw the bright colors and thought, oh, he's probably at a location he's not supposed to be at. What a rascal. And then I noticed it was the farm that got hit by heavy storm that I discussed in the 4th backstory video, so they added comedy to this serious scenario.
Now, I might just be a simple country farmer that's been sucked into a heavy storm, but I've experienced a trunade in my day.
It had the no-nonsense name of Localized Hurricane in Japanese. It's not a fun situation for all involved. Though, as we see on Storm, the farmer is somehow oblivious to any deadly weather unless he's stuck in it.
I'm right here, man. That's my farm. I'm Tim the farmer.
What I really like
Not the storm!
What I really like about the concept of Hey Trunade is that the townspeople are actively greeting this gigantic storm. It's like, let's say in the middle of a hurricane, we're just like, yo, what's up, hurricane? Pretty much the exact same thing, but written on a card.
Hey, trunade!
Yeah.
Bada bing, baby!
Come to kill me again? I see you're back for seconds.
Number 2, Beaver Warrior. This card is here not because of its inaccurate English name, but rather because of the questions that its Japanese name brings up. As with the previous cards, I never questioned Beaver Warrior's English name. I saw the rodent face and was like, ah yes, a purple beaver. But then looking at the tail, you'll see that it's not flat and wide like a beaver. It's long and thin like a mouse or rat. So you would probably assume that its Japanese name just translates to Mouse Warrior or something like that. No, her name in Japanese is Luis. Just Luis, no other descriptions.
That's his name. He doesn't need anything else. Just call him by his name.
Another great thing is, in the manga, Beaver Warrior is still known as Luis. What makes me so happy about that is Yami still has these giant stone slabs of his deck in his head. And so deep in Yami Yugi's subconscious is the imprisoned likeness of Luis.
I imagine that, like, Yami will be trying to go to sleep one day and all of a sudden just hear, Luis.
Let's rock it through some Some honorable mentions. Fushio Richie. His Japanese name is translated to Nosferatu Lich, with Nosferatu being Romanian for vampire, see the movie and the SpongeBob character Nosferatu, and Lich being an undead wizard necromancer. The Lich became Richie to go by the Japanese pronunciation, but the Nosferatu was changed to Fushio. The best explanation is that his English name was supposed to be Lich the Undead King, but when translated, they accidentally left the Japanese version of the planned English name, with Fushio being the Japanese word for undead. It makes sense hearing it that way, but I always like to think that this guy's name was just Richie. Like, hey, Richie, how's the Fushio going?
I would like to bring up a card. In Japanese, it is called The Turtle Once Called God.
Oh, that's my nickname in high school.
But in America, it's Testudo Erat Newman.
I love Testudo Rot Newman. That's Floodgate Turtle.
The English name of this card is Latin for tortoise was God.
Yeah, and there's Newman Erat Testudo, the god that will be called Turtle.
Where is this? Is this Egypt? Is this an Egyptian god card?
No, it's a mermail and Atlantean deity. It's the Forgotten Temple of the Deep.
I met God and it was a level 1 aqua type.
Twin Long Rods number 2. There is no Twin Long Rods number 1 in the TCG. We got number 2 before even getting number 1, and it was confusing for me as a kid. Yes, number 1 existed in the OCG and in some video games, but the concept that we just had the second version of this monster in English without the number 1 version is pretty funny. Also, Twin Long Rods number 1 is called gross in Japanese. Fitting.
Twin Long Rods number 2 is actually like the hottest card in Yu-Gi-Oh!
I'm really interested in the Gift of the Mystical Elf, which is a relatively minor change, but I think it's hilarious. They've kept it as Gift of the Magical Elf, and then they made it Gift of the Magical Elf, and then they brought it back. They brought back the, so it became Gift of the Mystical Elf. I said Magical Elf all those times.
You did.
Mystical Elf.
I really like Blackwing Armed Wing. Very minor change. For whatever reason, it just had 2 spaces. It was Blackwing, dramatic pause, Armed Wing. And if you have that same pause for any of the other cards, you're playing the deck wrong.
And go, DDD Divine Zero King Rage. This is a name that the English translation actually made shorter, which you don't see too often. They shortened the English name from the excessive Go, DDD Divine Zero King Zero God Ragey.
And I would also like to read out the ridiculous name for his attack name for this card. God Force End, ending epilogue, Eternal Rest.
Oh, that's an Undernight opening. That is some text that you see on the sides of Undernight. There is no doubt in my mind.
For number 1, we chose a monster whose Japanese name originally contained a term that is heavily used in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it was replaced with a pretty funny term in English. Their name also caused some other issues, so let's get right into it. Number 1, Celtic Guardian and Obnoxious Celtic Guard. Celtic Guardian is a seemingly normal name for a seemingly normal monster. His Japanese name is Elf Swordsman, but I like the translation. Celtic is a unique descriptor compared to Elf, considering how many different elves there are in Yu-Gi-Oh! That are unrelated. Since he was a staple of Yugi's deck, the name stuck regardless of whichever language you were watching in. However, getting creative by calling this elf a Guardian in his English translation caused some issues with a different archetype. When the Guardian archetype was introduced in Dark Crisis, you could identify those monsters since they all had the word Guardian in their names. There were a few cards in Japanese that already had Guardian in their name that were not part of the archetype, but it was negligible enough where no one really noticed, until you look at their main search card. Arsenal Summoner can search out any card with Guardian in its name. That is, if Guardian was in their Japanese name originally. If it was in their English name, that doesn't count, and you have a Frog the Jam scenario, but times 5. You have this seemingly random assortment of monsters with Guardian in their names that can't be searched, but the reason is they all had Guardian in their English names only, one of which was the Celtic Guardian. However, with the other non-Guardian archetype monsters, they could still be searched, since they had Guardian in their Japanese name, and the effect had to be consistent with the Japanese card, so it makes everything feel arbitrary on who was excluded in the English card. Hope that wasn't all too confusing, and they continued to release new cards with Guardian in the Japanese names Yu-Gi-Ohs that still were not a part of the Guardian archetype. They just used Guardian as a descriptor, so Arsenal Summoner continues to be all sorts of messed up.
Okay, can I rapid fire every single card it can summon?
I want you to do what makes you the most happy.
So here is a list of cards you can summon with this card that aren't specifically Guardian cards. And that would be Chronomaly Tula Guardian, Dimension Guardian, Fairy Guardian, Firewall Guardian, Gate Guardian, Guardian Angel Joan, Guardian Slime, Guardian Sphinx, Guardian Statue, Guardian of Felgrand, Guardian of Order, Guardian of the Golden Land, Guardian of the Throne Room, Infernity Guardian, Kawadaki Maru Guardian, Lost Guardian, Metal Guardian, Inchuria Guardian, Power of the Guardian, Skull Guardian, Stronghold Guardian, and Trust Guardian, making it one of the earliest spell, trap, and monster searchers.
Also, the only way you can actually get Guardian to your hand without cheating.
If it's either cheating or playing Arsenal Summoner, I'm going to cheat.
When Celtic Guardian was retrained, Konami knew that another Guardian in just English would cause some issues, so he was called Obnoxious Celtic Guard. Problem solved. But what's up with calling him obnoxious? That's a little rude. Well, it also is the main part of his name that was changed.
The original translation of his name was Retrained Elf Swordsman, and that is where the term retrain came from for cards that later gained effects or modified versions of themselves, because he was the first one of those. Also, this card debuted during a filler arc, and then was a mainstay in Yugi's deck.
That's right. His original name was the origin of a term we use in Yu-Gi-Oh! All the time. We all get hype when old cards get retrained to be useful or slightly better, and it all started with the Celtic Guardian needing an adjective to describe his new form.
He went from Elf Swordsman to the Retrained Elf Swordsman, and then he became the Baffling Elf Swordsman.
That's pretty obnoxious.
It's a shame we didn't get to see this staple term on the original retrained card in English. Obnoxious was a weird word to pick, and I don't know why they chose it, but it created a good Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged joke. So with the mass confusion it helped cause with the Guardians, and creating a famous Yu-Gi-Oh! Term that we never got to see in English, the duo of Celtic Guardians tops this list. Now, what did you think? With all the ways Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards have been renamed, I'm sure we couldn't cover all of your top favorites. So let us know your favorite or weirdest ways Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards were translated into English in the comments, whether we discussed them or not. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and we will see you in the next video.